Good evening, Shavua Tov. We are reading passages from Avodat Hashem, Inner Work. We are on page 85. The snake mentioned in the Garden of Eden is, of course, not a physical snake. The snake represents the desire to receive for oneself. So the Rab is saying that the snake in the story of the Garden of Eden is not a physical snake, it's metaphorical, and it's metaphor for the desire to receive for oneself. That is this force that tempts oneself away from God, tempts oneself to not focus solely on God, but to go for physical pleasure for oneself. The tree of knowledge is not, as children are taught, an apple tree from which Adam and Eve made the mistake of eating an apple. Everything spoken about here is a spiritual matter. The tree of knowledge is the ultimate experience of God that will be revealed in our completely rectified state. So again, another teaching about the Garden of Eden story, that the tree of knowledge, good and evil, is not an apple tree that Adam and Eve made a mistake of eating an apple from, but that everything spoken about in this story is a spiritual matter. And the tree of knowledge is actually the ultimate experience of God that will be revealed in our completely rectified state, in the state of revelation of the divine, of spirit, of our unity. The tree of knowledge is this ultimate experience of God that will be revealed at that point in time. So there will be I would say, a divine clarity of knowledge, good and evil, and understanding how they go together and everything that is part of the structure of existence, creation, and consciousness. The way to know if you're receiving a pleasure for self-benefit or in a state of divine service is by determining our ability to give up the pleasure if that were called for. If we're receiving a pleasure for self-benefit, we're unable to give it up. If we are receiving a pleasure in a state of divine service, the moment it is required, we can immediately give up the pleasure. So the Rav is distinguishing here between receiving pleasure for self-benefit versus receiving pleasure in a state of divine service. Right? When you're in a state of divine service, you are connected more to the giver than to the reception of the gift. More to the giver than to the gift. And so thus, as your consciousness is focused on God, you're ready to do whatever God will guide you to do. So if God were to ask you to give up the pleasure, you would immediately do it because your main focal point is service of the divine, and your main focal point is on the divine rather than on the gift itself. But if you're receiving for self-benefit, your focus is on the gift, on the pleasure of that gift. And therefore, we'd be unable to give it up if we were asked to give it up. So receiving, this is pointing to like this the highest level of the giving-receiving combination, which is receiving in order to give, which means that when we receive pleasure in the most rectified state, we are receiving it because it is what God wants for us, because we're in tune with the purpose of creation, which is to give humanity the greatest pleasure possible, which is the union and sameness of form with the divine. And thus, we are receiving that gift of bliss through the union because it is what God wants for us. And that's why we are receiving it, in order to give back to the Creator in the form of completing the purpose of creation. So we're doing what God wants, and God wants to give us the pleasure. So it's the best of all of the worlds combined, because then we are actually receiving in order to give. The Bala Sulam says that our desire to receive has a head aspect called mind and a body aspect called heart. The Bala Sulam says that our desire to receive has a head aspect called mind and a body aspect called heart. So I think he's distinguishing between these two aspects of the desire to receive, that one of the aspects is through the head. It is a desire to receive that comes focused in the mind, in that head or mind space, is one aspect of the desire to receive. Oh, sorry about that. And another aspect is receiving from the body, and that is called heart. So it's interesting how the body, receiving through the body, is called heart. Gam hoach balev. Yeah, I don't know exactly why the one for the body is called heart. The essence of Judaism is the spiritual practice of believing, of emunah. Believing defies what the ego understands, right? Believing defies what the ego understands. So again, this concept of emunah is central to the spiritual practice of Judaism. The essence of Judaism is the spiritual practice of emunah. It is the emunah, this embodied faith, that defies what the ego understands. It transcends what the ego understands to be reality. It transcends personal experience and goes beyond that. That is what's needed in the world of exile, in this Galut paradigm, where God's presence is hidden, is we need emunah to transcend our lived experience, what we know, what we see, and what our egos are attached to, and to transcend all of that in order to be in a state of divine service. It takes a great deal of spiritual work to realize the importance of transcending self-serving pleasure. It takes a great deal of spiritual work to realize the importance of transcending self-serving pleasure. So where we are in our regular life, it may not seem like transcending personal pleasure is all that important. Like, what's the big deal about pleasure? But the Rav is saying that actually that's correct, because it takes a great deal of spiritual work to actually get to the place where you realize how important it is to transcend self-serving pleasure. And at first, we won't even realize how deep its importance is. Only after a lot of spiritual work do we come to really understand how self-serving pleasure really keeps us separated from the divine. It keeps us in a state of difference of form with the Creator. It keeps us stuck in separate self-consciousness, because I'm just concerned with trying to get my own physical needs and pleasures met. And it is so contrary to God's essence and energy, which is all giving and all loving, and totally full, and not need of any kind of any need whatsoever, no lack. But it only happens after there's a lot of spiritual work that we come to really recognize how important it is to work to transcend self-serving pleasure and come to a place of giving, and giving from a place of feeling connected to others as an extension of the divine, as an extension of our own selves. Everything we see in this world is drawn forth from roots in spiritual reality, and is just revealed here in a physical form. So there's many Kabbalistic teachings that talk about roots and branches, and that the roots are actually up in the spiritual domain, and the branches are down here in the physical world. And so everything that we see here in the physical reality has a root up in the spiritual dimension, and it's drawing forth from that spiritual root in the spiritual reality, the spiritual dimension, and it's manifest here in physical form. Okay, hope you have a lovely night, and we'll see you tomorrow.